Thank you all for staying. There's so many of you so late in the day. I'm just going to set myself up with a timer because the last thing I want to do as the last speaker is to go over time. And I also want to thank the organizers for including me in this. It has been fascinating so far. Similar to Lisa and Oliver's excellent talks, I'll be talking about technical studies. And to start with a broad question first, what happens to conflict-affected heritage that is movable? If looting is causing erasure of these artifacts' original context, how can we get them back, and how do we reconstruct their story? To do that, to talk about how we might possibly do that, I'm going to be talking about cuneiform tablets. So to start with, what's a tablet? What's a cuneiform tablet? Cuneiform tablet is made out of clay. It comes typically from Mesopotamia, which is between the Tigris and the Euphrates in southern Iraq. It has also, they can come from Syria, Turkey, Iran, throughout the Middle East. This one is an Ur-3 tablet in the Smithsonian's collection. And the vast majority of tablets are Ur-3 tablets, which is a time period that's from about 2100 to about 2004 BC. And this about 100-year period is one of the most documented periods in history because of these small clay tablets. They're about this big. People wrote on them when they were wet with reeds, and they convey a vast amount of information. You're going to find everything from tax records to military shipments to where people sent their sheep that year for grazing. The things that collect on the bottom of your purse, that's what tablets are, and that's what really are in the archives. It's the stuff that clutters up in your desk in the corner. And so, oops, how do I do this one? Oops. This is an example with the full translation of an old Babylonian tablet, which comes somewhat later, written in Akkadian in a similar style, also in the Smithsonian's collection. The picture of it's way far down there on the right. And we talked a little bit about the region these come from, just so you understand the spread for Ur-3 in particular, for this small time frame. It's really densely concentrated, and there are hundreds of these tablets, and they're a very, very prized collector's item. Which brings me to the conflict part of this. We're all familiar with what happened in 2003 with the Iraq National Museum in Baghdad and the devastating loss of artifacts there. At the time, it was estimated about 15,000 artifacts were stolen. It's likely more than that. And initial reports that came back were, and this is just one example of a photo that was seized by local officials, that about 6,000 artifacts had been returned to the museum. Didn't really include that many tablets, and the problem with that 6,000 number is that there was no guaranteeing those artifacts were actually from the museum. That 6,000 artifacts were just artifacts that were recovered by the police at that time. In fact, most of the stuff that was recovered in that 6,000 artifacts came from looters' pits at archaeological sites throughout southern Iraq. And here you see an example, so you know what I'm talking about when I talk about dots on a screen. This is the ground image of looters on the ground at an archaeological site in southern Iraq called Isin. In the middle is a view from a helicopter of a similar pit, and then on the far right is a view from a satellite image at the time. So this was all happening 2003 through 2008, right when satellite imagery was getting good enough that the commercial use of it allowed us to be able to see these looters' pits. And so at 2 sites in southern Iraq, back when I was a graduate student, to talk about the extent of this damage, we looked at what was happening at this site, which is called Umma. It's in southern Iraq, where those red circles were on the map. And you see these divots here, and initially they might look like sand dunes, but they're actually looters' pits. And we've seen these images before. When you start with a site from the satellite view, the previous image was helicopter, it's sometimes difficult to see some of those pits, but when you zoom in and you can contrast it, you see quite a bit of detail. And so each of those blue dots represents the looters' pits that existed there in 2003, prior to the invasion. And as Brian Leone already mentioned, there had been extensive looting and damage to sites throughout southern Iraq through all the sanctions and the wars in the 90s and in the 80s. So looting wasn't new to southern Iraq, particularly not to Umma. But these are, the red dots are the new looters' pits that existed in 2008 at the same site. And you can see that difference is rather striking. And that difference is because they were looking for tablets. This is the difference between 2005 then and 2008, with the green being additional pits. And that's just the numbers, in case you're not looking for just the visual. And then this is colleagues at the site of Umma going to inspect a recent pit at the time, because one of the problems was that looting was taking place across the region. And it was the direct result of a lack of infrastructure and security and jobs available for local population. Years later, Elizabeth Stone would publish an overview of all of what she had found as the looted sites in this one region in southern Iraq, and that just gives you a sampling of how widespread this issue was. And this is certainly not something that has been limited to southern Iraq for tablets. I heard earlier this morning, Salam mentioned the tablets from Ebla, and I want to just reference that here you see looting at the site of Mari. Those red circles, that contrast, those red circles on the bottom, those are looters' pits. And similarly, you can see that growth over time, going after anything that has cuneiform on it. And the images from Mari, they're 2014, 2015. Later in 2015, we'd also learned that ISIS was very much looking for cuneiform artifacts. And so tablets, as the main cuneiform artifact, are very much at risk in these conflict situations in greater Mesopotamia. Which brings us to cases here in the US and elsewhere. Probably the most notable, the one that got the most press, was the case of Hobby Lobby and the cuneiform tablets that were part of that seizure. So 450 approximate cuneiform tablets in that seizure. And those cuneiform tablets represent a really extensive and important collection from, I'm told, the site of Isengrig in southern Iraq. And the Hobby Lobby case created some questions for those of us who work in the field. I'm an archaeologist. I've worked on looting issues before. My background is in very traditional Mesopotamian archaeology. I had to take Akkadian and Sumerian in graduate school. I had to translate tablets. And the Hobby Lobby case raised some questions that I was frustrated by, because there's a limit to how much we can help law enforcement. How can we assist them when we don't necessarily know exactly what country these tablets come from? What if there's another seizure and we don't have detailed information about a site like Isengrig in the tablets so they can be repatriated correctly? It also, the larger question, the one I started with, it really also raised that issue of how do we help movable heritage coming out of conflict areas return to its story? How do we kind of get rid of some of the erasure that has gone on as a component in that conflict? And this becomes particularly important when galleries, and don't get me in trouble for naming and shaming here, but this becomes particularly important when online sales and galleries are often describing things rather than Iraqi or Mesopotamian or Syrian or Anatolian. They're describing them as, for instance, Eastern Mediterranean or South Asian, which makes it very difficult for these objects to have their full story. So, because we're academics, we held a conference. Generously funded by the Smithsonian's Scholarly Studies program. We brought together about 50 academics, cuneiform scholars, and law enforcement professionals to have a conversation on what was happening with technology, what was going on that might help us answer some of these questions. And one of the four main takeaways, which I won't bore you with because it's late in the day, but really one of the big ones that I'm going to talk a little bit about is number 2, and that is what sort of technical work can be done in the future. What do we know could we possibly apply to these tablets to give them more information? And much of this initial framing was done by Manuel Molina, who's at a research center in Madrid. And he has created something called the BDTNS, which is the database of all Sumerian texts and Neo-Sumerian texts. And it has almost all of these tablets on it. All of the Ur-3 tablets that are known and published are recorded in this corpus. And his research has shown a real increase in sites that we had never heard about, that had never been translated before in tablets, being listed in tablets coming out of the ground after 1991. And so you see there on the far right, I'm going to just highlight 2 of his graphs because I think they're really striking. Those are yours. This is the site of Gara Sharna. I'm going to mispronounce that. And the first known tablet that's published of the site starts in 1999, and there's no evidence of it before. Similarly, the site of Isenkrigg, which is the site that the Hobby Lobby tablets were likely, some of them are likely being identified from. The first known instance of it is in 2002. The site had not really been published ever before 2002, which the field of Sumerology is very old at this point. So if for the last 60 years or so no one had heard of it, is rather surprising. And so Manuel Molina has suggested that just the dates of publication of those tablets that have those site names suggests how extensive that looting was. What he was using was traditional textual interpretation, and that is where you interpret the words on the tablet. It's important. It's the traditional way it's done. It's also very time-consuming. It's not something that law enforcement can do. It's a limited number of scholars, and growing more limited every year, can do this. And it also excludes sites that have not yet been known in the corpus or tablets that are broken. So one of the new technologies that's being applied to this is portable XRF. And it's a technology that I am not going to get into because I'm not enough of an expert to explain it to you. But what I do want to highlight is that it's non-destructive. And one of the things that XRF is very famous for in archaeological fields, what I knew it for was for obsidian, that it has been really helpful with sourcing obsidian artifacts. And many folks have talked about how while it might be possible to use XRF to source the location of ceramics, there are a number of challenges with it. And one of the main challenges with that is that, as this map illustrates, where clay exists, the type of clay that you might be looking at could cover an entire country. So in Iraq, for instance, this becomes a problem. This is very difficult for ceramic vessels, and there's a number of folks doing research on that. For ceramic tablets, this is different. Cuneiform tablets, oops, we're gonna go back for a second. Cuneiform tablets require a specific type of clay that has elasticity in it so that it can actually hold the written text on it. As a result, you have to look for those sources, and they're more distinguishable in the chemical traces than they are for ceramic vessels. One of these studies, I'm going to just highlight a couple of them. One of these studies is done by Ed Stratford at Brigham Young University, and he's looking at trade networks of tablets from Assyria, from Iraq, and northern Iraq, up into Turkey and Anatolia, and trying to source where those came from. And he has gotten some good differentiation in his results with his portable XRF study. Another example comes out of the University of Reading and the Ashmolean, where they were looking not only at tablets, but also clay sealings, seals that were impressed, and doing an analysis where they were able to match what the portable XRF was telling them with what they were finding listed in the, what they were assuming was the case listed both in the translations of the tablets as well as in the images on the sealings. And the University of Chicago has a project that I'm consulting on called The Far From Home, exploring the applications of non-destructive XRF clay analysis for the study of cuneiform tablets. And they're looking at a number of sites, and what's important is these are sites where they had excavated tablets. And the idea then is to contrast their findings with tablets that have not been excavated, that we do not have a known origin for. And they have also been finding some interesting preliminary results. They're not at a point of being finished yet, so I can't report on too much beyond that. One of the things they're finding is quite a bit of remains of what looks like, they're looking for stuff to make them out of more plastic. So that there's quite a bit of sulfur in a number of these and other chemical traces, though they're not quite at the point of having results yet, which leads us to talking about both the potential for and limitations of PXRF. Because the technology is relatively new, because it is not tied to anything directly, the XRF itself can lack precision. It requires a space to look at the tablet on. It's non-destructive, but it requires a space on the tablet to look at. And there is some question about tablet treatments and how those might have impacted the results as they go forward. So although we have high hopes for portable XRF, because it is non-destructible, because it's portable, we could bring it into museums or into law enforcement cases. We do have some concerns with, thus far, it is, the results are not comparable between the studies I mentioned, and the results are not comparable within different ceramic groupings. And that is something that they're still trying to figure out. Basically, the work is ongoing, and so this is more of a potential talk. This is one of those talks you give after you did not get a grant, so you are talking about the potential of that. And one of the things that I think would really help the field pursue this further would be tying it to an SEM-based micro XRF. And that would actually base the portable XRF results with much more detailed laboratory-based, SEM-based micro XRF. There's a number of advantages to this, which I've listed up here. The big one, as far in my opinion, being that the calibration is more controlled. And so that really ground truths what we would be doing then theoretically in the field, or as we visit different collections with the portable XRF. And with that, I want to thank you all for your attention, and I think it's time for Q&A for us.